Sign it now. The house belongs to Jessica. Those words cut through the warm music of the wedding reception like something completely out of place, and for a second I thought I had misheard them. Bata. My father, Robert Carter, stood just a few feet away from the floral arch, holding a folded set of documents in his hand as if this was the most natural conversation to have in the middle of my sister Jessica's wedding. I remember the way the guests kept smiling, unaware that something quietly unbearable was unfolding just outside their attention. My mother, Linda, leaned in slightly, her voice calm but firm, as if she was discussing seating arrangements instead of rewriting my life. "Emily, don't make this harder than it needs to be," she said, motioning toward the paper. I stood there in my pale blue dress, feeling the noise of the celebration continue around us while something inside me slowed down completely. The house they were talking about wasn't just any property. It was the small home I had built from the ground up over nearly a decade, working extra shifts, saving every possible dollar, taking out loans I paid back one careful month at a time. A home valued at nearly $500,000, but to me it was worth far more than that number could ever explain. It was nights without sleep, weekends spent painting walls myself, learning plumbing fixes from videos because hiring help wasn't an option. It was the first thing in my life that felt like it truly belonged to me. And now, in the middle of my sister's wedding, they were asking me to sign it away. I looked at Jessica first. She was glowing in the distance, laughing with her friends, completely unaware of the conversation happening just a few steps away. Then I looked back at my parents. There was no hesitation in their expressions. No doubt. Just expectation, like this outcome had already been decided without me. "Why here?" I finally asked, my voice quieter than I intended. My father exhaled as if I had asked something unreasonable. "Because this is the first time we're all together in months," he said. "And because Jessica deserves stability starting her marriage. That house would give her that." I almost laughed, but nothing came out. Jessica already had stability. She had support, celebrations, and a family gathered around her on her wedding day. What she didn't have was my house. I felt the moment stretch, the weight of their words pressing into the edges of my thoughts. My mother stepped closer, lowering her voice in a way that made it feel even more controlled. "Jubel lived there alone for years, Emily. It's too much space for one person anyway. This is the practical decision." Practical. That word always came up when something was being taken from me. I glanced down at the document again. My name was already printed on the lines that would erase it from ownership. They had prepared this. Not asked. Not discussed. Prepared. Around voice, someone laughed loudly, clinking glasses in celebration, and the contrast made everything feel unreal, like I had stepped into a moment that didn't belong to my life at all. I didn't respond immediately. Instead, I studied their faces the way I would study strangers. My parents, who had raised me, were now standing in front of me with complete confidence that I would simply comply. As if the years I spent building that house, sacrificing everything to create something stable for myself, meant less than the convenience of reshaping it for someone else. My father extended the papers slightly. "Just sign it, Emily," he said. "Let's not turn this into a scene." That was when I realized something important. In their minds, I already wasn't a part of the scene. I was just the person expected to clean it up quietly. And for the first time that night, I didn't move. The silence that followed felt heavier than the words themselves. My father was still holding the documents out toward me, but now it no longer felt like a request. It felt like a final step in something that had already been set in motion long before I arrived at the wedding. Around Buesi, the celebration continued as if nothing unusual was happening. Glasses clinkled, music floated through the open garden space, and guests smiled for photographs under soft golden lights. It was almost surreal how easily the world kept moving while mine had just stopped. I slowly lowered my gaze from the papers to my parents. My mother, Linda, was watching me with a controlled patience, the kind that suggested she believed resistance was temporary. My father, Robert, looked more impatient than angry, as if my hesitation was simply an inconvenience delaying something already decided. Emily, my mother said again, softer this time, we are not asking you to lose anything important. You still have your job, your independence. But Jessica is starting her marriage. She needs something stable. You understand that, right? He did understand. He understood it clearly enough to recognize what was missing from her explanation. Not once had she asked what I needed. Not once had she considered that the house she was talking about was not just an asset, but the only thing in my life I had built entirely on my own terms. He had been 28 when I first signed the mortgage papers. At the time, the interest rate had been nearly 7%, and every financial advisor I spoke to told me I was taking on too much risk. But I had done it anyway. I worked overtime at the accounting firm downtown, took weekend freelance work, and learned how to manage repairs myself because there was no room in my budget for contractors. He remembered nights sitting on the floor of that empty house, surrounded by paint cans and instruction manuals, telling myself that every inch I finished was one step closer to something no one could take away from me. And now here they were, standing in front of me, asking me to give it up as if it had always belonged to them to redistribute. My sister Jessica walked past in the distance, laughing as someone adjusted her veil. She looked happy, completely unaware that her future was being discussed a few yards away like a transaction. He wondered if she would have agreed to this if she knew. Or if she would have simply accepted it the same way everything else in our family always seemed to be accepted, without question. My father cleared his throat, breaking my thoughts. We do not have all day, Emily. The lawyer already prepared everything. We just need your signature. That detail landed differently. Not just a request. Not just a discussion. A prepared arrangement. I looked at the paper again, noticing how clean and final it looked. No room for negotiation. No space for my voice. Used lines waiting to erase ownership from one name and transfer it to another. You already decided this, I said quietly. It was not a question. My mother did not deny it. Instead, she exhaled slowly, as if I was making something simple unnecessarily complicated. We decided what makes sense for the family, she replied. You have always been strong, Emily. Jewel will be fine. Jessica needs more support right now. The word family echoed in my mind, but it felt hollow in that moment. He glanced back toward the reception area where laughter rose again, someone tapping a glass to announce a toast. Everything looked perfect from the outside. That was always how it looked from the outside. He took a slow breath, feeling the weight of years of effort, sacrifice, and silence gather into a single point of clarity. Then I stepped slightly back from the document, letting my hands fall to my sides. My father frowned. What are you doing? He asked. He did not answer immediately. He was still watching them, trying to understand when exactly I had stopped being a daughter in their eyes and started becoming an asset to be reassigned. And for the first time, I realized I was no longer confused. He was simply seeing it clearly. My father's expression changed the moment I stepped back from the papers. It was subtle at first, just a tightening around his jaw, but I had known that look my entire life. It was the look he used when he believed someone was being unreasonable and he needed to bring the situation back under control. My mother noticed it too and immediately softened her tone, as if adjusting the emotional temperature of the conversation could still bring me back into compliance. Emily, she said carefully, do not turn this into something emotional. This is not about feelings. It is about fairness within the family. He almost smiled at that. fairness. It was interesting how that word only appeared when something was being taken from me. He looked past them for a moment, toward the reception area again. Jessica was now surrounded by guests, her laughter blending into the background music, completely untouched by what was happening just a short distance away. He wondered how long this had been planned. Not just the paperwork, but the timing, the setting, the decision to bring it into a place where I would be least likely to cause a scene. My father stepped slightly closer, lowering his voice. We are giving you a simple solution. You sign the transfer, Jessica gets the house, and everything stays within the family where it belongs. That last phrase hit harder than the rest. Where it belongs. He repeated it silently in my mind, trying to understand when I had been moved outside of that definition. My mother followed his lead, her voice steady but firm. You have always been independent, Emily. You do not need that house in the same way she does. You have your career. You have your life. My career. My life. They spoke about them as if they were separate from everything I had built, as if the house I had fought for was just an unnecessary piece of excess I had no right to keep. He took another slow breath, feeling something inside me settle into clarity rather than confusion. It was not anger yet. Not sadness either. It was something colder, quieter, like finally understanding a pattern that had been repeating for years without me naming it. He remembered every time I had been asked to adjust my schedule for family events that never adjusted for me. Every time I had been told I was too sensitive when I questioned decisions that always seemed to benefit someone else. Every time I had been expected to step aside because someone else needed more support. My father tapped the papers lightly. Emily, we are still waiting. There was no patience in his voice anymore. Only expectation. He looked at the document again. My name printed neatly on lines that would erase my ownership of something I had spent nearly a decade of my life building. And for the first time, I realized the request was never really about the house. It was about the assumption that I would always give up whatever I had, simply because they asked me to. My mother reached out slightly, her hand hovering near my arm in a gesture that was meant to appear gentle but felt more like guidance back into place. Do not make this harder than it needs to be, she said quietly. He finally met her eyes directly. There was no raised voice. No dramatic reaction. Just a steady awareness that something fundamental had shifted. Around us, the sound of celebration continued, distant and unaware. And in that contrast, everything became painfully clear. He was no longer part of the decisions being made about my life. He was simply expected to approve them. For a moment, no one spoke. My mother's hand slowly lowered back to her side, and my father's patience finally cracked into something sharper. Emily, he said again, this time with less softness, we are not asking for something unreasonable. This is a simple transfer. It keeps everything clean, keeps everything within the family structure. The word structure made something inside me tighten. It sounded less like love and more like organization, like I was a misplaced item that needed to be filed correctly. He looked at them both, and for the first time I allowed myself to see them without the filter of expectation I had carried for years. My mother, who had once told me that hard work would always be recognized in the end. My father, who had taught me that responsibility meant standing on your own feet. Yet here they were, standing in front of me, asking me to give up something I had built entirely on those lessons. He remembered the first year I moved into that house. It was unfinished, the floors still raw wood, the kitchen only partially installed. He slept on a mattress in the living room because I could not afford furniture yet. He worked double shifts, came home exhausted, and still spent nights painting walls myself because hiring help meant delaying payments I had promised myself I would never miss. There were days I ate simple meals just to make sure the mortgage was covered. There were nights I sat on that floor alone, listening to the silence of a space that was mine but not yet fully formed. And slowly, over years, it became something real. Something stable. Something that I had never asked anyone to help me build. My father's voice pulled me back into the present. You are not listening, he said, more firmly now. This is not negotiable. Jessica is starting her life. She needs support. You have already had yours. He blinked at that. Already had mine. As if stability was something limited that could only be distributed once within a family. My mother stepped in again, her tone now carrying something closer to disappointment. We raised you to be strong, Emily. Do not turn that strength into stubbornness. Saying this will solve everything. He almost wanted to ask what everything meant to them. Because from where I stood, nothing about this felt like something that needed solving. It felt like something being taken. He glanced again toward the reception. Jessica was now cutting into the wedding cake, smiling as guests applauded. The sound reached me faintly, like it belonged to another world entirely. A world where I was still expected to smile and agree and make things easy for everyone else. My father took a breath, clearly deciding to end the discussion before it went any further. We are not going to argue in front of everyone, he said. Take a moment. Think about what is right. Then he placed the papers on the edge of a nearby table, as if leaving them there would eventually make me pick them up. My mother gave me one last look, softer now but still certain. We are doing this because we care about the family, she said. And then they both turned slightly away, as if the conversation had already concluded. He stood there watching them rejoin the celebration, watching them slip back into the warm noise of laughter and music as if nothing had changed. But everything had. Because in that moment, I finally understood that I was no longer being asked to participate in a decision. I was being informed of one. After my parents walked away, the noise of the wedding reception returned like nothing had happened, but I could no longer hear it the same way. Everything felt slightly distant, slightly distorted, as if I was standing behind glass while the rest of the world continued moving freely. He stood alone for a few seconds, watching them rejoin Jessica and the guests. My mother smiled. Again, effortlessly, as if the conversation we had just finished had been nothing more than a brief logistical discussion. My father placed a hand on Jessica's shoulder, laughing at something one of the guests said, his posture relaxed, satisfied, complete. It struck me then how quickly I had been removed from the emotional center of my own family. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Just quietly, over time, until I was standing on the edge of it all, expected to step in when needed and step out when inconvenient. He walked slowly toward the table where the documents had been left. The paper was still there, resting neatly as if waiting patiently for compliance. He did not touch it at first. Instead, I looked at the signature line, my name printed in clean black ink, reduced to a formality. It was strange how something so permanent could be treated so casually by people who were not the ones losing it. He thought about the house again. Not as a financial asset, but as a sequence of moments. The early mornings when I would sit on the back steps with a cup of coffee, watching the light spread across a yard I had landscaped myself. The evenings when I would come home exhausted and still feel a sense of relief the moment I stepped through the door, because it was mine. There was no history of permission attached to it. No conditions. Used effort and time and persistence. He heard footsteps behind me and turned slightly. My mother had returned alone. My father was still near the reception area, speaking with guests. She approached slowly, her expression softer now, almost careful. Emily, she said, lowering her voice, your father is frustrated, but he is not wrong. We are trying to avoid conflict. Do you know how families can become when things are not settled properly? He looked at her for a long moment before responding. This is already settled, I said quietly. She hesitated, as if unsure how to respond to that. Then she reached out and gently touched my arm, a gesture that would have once felt comforting. "You are making this harder than it needs to be," she said. That phrase again. Harder than it needs to be. I began to understand that in their version of reality, difficulty was not defined by fairness or truth, but by resistance. I was the problem, not the decision. She stepped back slightly, glancing toward the guests. "Just sign it," she added. "Let today remain peaceful for Jessica. She should not have to deal with this on her wedding day." I almost looked toward Jessica again, but stopped myself. Because I realized something important. They had chosen this moment precisely because it was her wedding day. A day when I would be least likely to resist, least likely to create disruption, least likely to be seen as anything other than difficult if I said no. My mother adjusted her posture, preparing to leave again. "We will talk after the ceremony," she said, as if the matter was still open for discussion. Then she walked away. I remained standing there, alone beside the table, the paper still waiting. Around me, the wedding continued, laughter rising and falling like waves that did not reach where I was standing. And in that quiet space, I understood that the question was no longer whether I would sign it. The question was what it meant that they believed I would. The sound of laughter drifted back toward me again as I stood beside the untouched document, but it no longer felt connected to my reality. It felt like background noise from a life I was no longer part of. I slowly exhaled, noticing how calm I had become, not because the situation was acceptable, but because something inside me had already shifted past shock into recognition. I finally understood that this was not a conversation. It was a test. And in their minds, the outcome had already been decided before I ever arrived. My father returned first, walking with the easy confidence of someone who believed control had already been secured. I stopped a few feet away, glancing at the document still resting on the table. "We are going to finish this properly," he said in a low voice. "Emily, do not embarrass yourself in front of everyone. Jessica's guests are beginning to notice something is off." He followed his gaze briefly toward the reception area. A few people were indeed looking in our direction now, curiosity beginning to replace celebration. That voice. Intentional. He could feel it. My mother joined him moments later, adjusting her bracelet as if preparing to reset the tone again. "We are not trying to hurt you," she said softly. "We are trying to avoid a situation that will become more complicated later. You have always been the reasonable one. The reasonable one." He repeated that phrase silently. It had been used so often throughout my life that I had stopped questioning what it meant. It usually meant the one who adjusts. The one who yields. The one who makes things easier for others at their own expense. He looked at both of them now, really looked at them, and something unfamiliar settled in my chest. Not anger yet. Not grief. Something clearer. Light distance forming where closeness used to be. "You already told everyone this was decided," I said quietly. My father did not deny it. Instead, he gave a small nod, as if confirming a detail rather than acknowledging a decision that affected my entire life. "It will be decided now," he replied. "All you need to do is sign." He turned slightly, looking at the pen placed neatly beside the papers. Someone had thought about every detail of this moment. Even the pen was positioned as if my signature was simply the final step in a process that had already been completed emotionally without me. My mother stepped closer again, lowering her voice. "Emily, please. We are asking you as your parents. Do not make this about pride." That word landed differently. Pride. As if wanting to keep something I built with my own effort was an emotional flow rather than a rational boundary. I took a slow breath and looked past them again, toward Jessica. She was smiling brightly, completely unaware of how close her wedding had come to becoming something else entirely. I wondered if she would ever know. Or if this moment would simply be absorbed into family history as something I should have handled better. My father exhaled sharply, impatience finally breaking through his controlled tone. "We are running out of patience," he said. "This does not need to become a scene." He almost smiled at that. Because somehow, in their version of events, the scene had not already begun. He reached out slowly and placed my hand near the document, not touching it yet. Both of them watched immediately, their attention sharpening. For the first time, I realized they were not only expecting compliance. They were expecting inevitability. And that was when I understood something that changed the entire shape of the moment. He was not the one being asked to sign. He was the one being watched to see if I would still comply. My hand hovered just above the document, and the change in their reaction was immediate. My father's eyes narrowed slightly, not in confusion but in anticipation, as if he believed I was finally about to comply. My mother stepped half a step closer, her voice lowering again, careful and controlled. "That is the right thing to do, Emily," she said. "Just sign it and we can all move on from this. Jessica should not have to worry about family tension on her wedding day." He slowly withdrew my hand, not touching the paper yet. The air between us felt different now, not louder, not more intense, but more precise, as if every word carried weight it had not carried before. He looked at them again, really looking, and for the first time I noticed how rehearsed everything felt. Not just the request, but their certainty. My father's posture was steady, almost practiced, as if he had already imagined this moment going exactly as planned. My mother's calm tone was not emotional comfort, it was strategic reassurance. They were not trying to persuade me. They were guiding me toward a conclusion they had already accepted as final. "You are making this more difficult than necessary," my father said again, his voice tightening slightly. "We did not want this to become uncomfortable." He nodded slowly, not in agreement, but in understanding. That was the word they kept returning to. Uncomfortable. As if the problem was not what they were asking of me, but my awareness of it. He glanced toward the reception once more. Jessica was now standing near the center of the crowd, smiling as guests raised glasses in celebration. No one there knew that a separate conversation was deciding something that would permanently reshape my life. Or perhaps they did not need to know. Perhaps that was the point. My mother followed my gaze and gently placed her hand near my arm again. "Emily," she said softly, "you have always been the strongest in this family. That is why we know you will understand this is not about taking from you. It is about balance." Balance. He almost repeated the word out loud, but instead I let it sit in my mind. Because there had never been balance. There had only ever been expectation placed on one side, and adjustment demanded from the other. My father cleared his throat. "We are not going to revisit this again," he said firmly. "Either you sign now, or we will have to address it later in a way that may not be pleasant for anyone." That was the first time his voice carried something closer to warning than instruction. Not anger. Not emotion. Used certainty that resistance would be managed one way or another. He finally stepped back from the table completely. The pen remained untouched beside the document, perfectly aligned, waiting for the moment I would stop being difficult. My mother's expression shifted slightly, concern mixing with frustration. "Emily, do not do this," she said quietly. "You are not thinking clearly right now." He almost smiled at that. Because for the first time in a very long time, I was thinking more clearly than I ever had. I looked at both of them, standing there in the middle of my sister's wedding, asking me to erase years of effort as if it were a minor adjustment. And I understood something I had not been willing to see before. This was not about the house. It was about the assumption that I would always step aside when asked. He reached out slowly, not toward the pen, but toward the edge of the paper, and slid it a few inches closer to me. Not accepting it. Not rejecting it. just moving it into my control. My father's eyes followed the movement immediately. My mother went still. And in that small shift of distance, I saw something I had never seen before in their expressions. Uncertainty. The moment the paper shifted slightly toward me, the entire atmosphere changed. It was subtle, almost invisible to anyone watching from a distance, but within that small space between us, everything tightened. My father's eyes tracked the document immediately, and my mother's hand froze halfway between reaching for me and pulling back. Neither of them spoke at first. It was as if they were waiting for the version of me they knew to return, the one who would lower her head, take the pen, and end the conversation without resistance. But I did not move toward the pen. He did not step back either. He simply kept my hand resting near the edge of the paper, as if acknowledging its existence without surrendering to it. My father finally broke the silence. "Emily," he said sharply, "do not play games. This is not the time for pride or misunderstanding." He looked up at him slowly. His voice was controlled, but there was a new layer underneath it now, something less certain than before. My mother stepped in immediately, her tone softer but more urgent. "We are not asking for something unreasonable. You are making this more complicated than it has to be." He nodded once, as if absorbing her words, but inside something had already shifted completely. Complicated was an interesting choice of word for them to use. Because from my perspective, nothing about the situation was complicated. It was clear. Almost painfully clear. He finally pulled the document fully toward me, not aggressively, not dramatically, just enough to bring it into my space. My father's posture stiffened. My mother's eyes narrowed slightly. That small movement had disrupted something they had clearly expected to remain fixed. Around Wacy, the wedding continued, laughter rising again in the distance, glasses clinking, music flowing through the garden. No one else noticed the change in pressure happening at this table. He glanced down at the document again, then slowly looked back up at them. "You already prepared everything," I said quietly. It was not a question. My father exhaled through his nose, a controlled sign of frustration. "Of course we prepared it," he replied. "We are responsible people. We do not make decisions like this without planning." That sentence revealed more than he intended. Responsible people. As if responsibility meant deciding for someone else without their input. My mother leaned in. Slightly again, trying to recover control of the moment. "Emily, we are still your family," she said. "That has not changed. This is about helping Jessica begin her life with stability. Do you understand what that means?" He looked past her again, toward Jessica. She was smiling, unaware of the negotiation happening that used her future as justification. He wondered if she would call it stability if she knew what it required from someone else. My father's voice lowered again, more deliberate this time. "We are giving you a simple choice. Sign, and everything remains peaceful. Refuse, and this becomes something none of us wants to deal with here." He noticed the shift in tone. It was no longer persuasion. It was containment. The assumption was no longer that I would agree. It was that I would eventually comply under pressure. He placed my hand flat on the table beside the document. "Not on it. Beside it." A clear separation. My mother's expression changed slightly, confusion mixing with irritation. "Emily," she said again, "you are not thinking practically." He almost responded, but stopped myself. Because for the first time, I realized they were not listening for understanding. They were listening for submission. And I was no longer speaking their language. He looked at both of them, and in that moment, I understood something fully. They had not brought this request to me because they believed I would agree. They brought it because they believed I could be made to agree. And that difference changed everything. For a long moment after that, no one spoke. The noise of the wedding seemed to push in closer, as if trying to fill the silence we had created. He could hear laughter again near the garden tables, the soft clinking of glasses, the distant sound of music that now felt completely disconnected from where I stood. My hand remained resting beside the document, not moving toward it, not moving away. That stillness alone seemed to unsettle them more than any argument I could have made. My father finally broke first. "Emily," he said, his voice lower now but more controlled, "we are done discussing this informally. If you are not going to cooperate, we will need to proceed differently." He looked at him carefully. The word cooperate no longer sounded like a request. It sounded like an expectation that had never included my consent. My mother stepped closer again, her expression tightening. "Do not force this into something unpleasant," she said quietly. "Everyone is watching Jessica today. These should not become about you." That sentence landed differently than the others. Not because it was harsher, but because it revealed the structure underneath everything they had been saying. This was never about fairness. It was about visibility. About control of perception. About ensuring that I remained in the role assigned to me, even while my own life was being adjusted without permission. He slowly looked past them toward the reception once more. Jessica was now surrounded by guests, smiling brightly, unaware that her name had been used as justification for something she had not asked for. He wondered how many times in this family decisions had been made in her name, or in mine, or in someone else's, without anyone ever being asked directly. My father exhaled sharply. "You are making this embarrassing," he said. "At your sister's wedding of all places." He almost laughed at that. Not because it was funny, but because of the timing. As if embarrassment had not already been carefully placed on me before I even arrived. As if I had not been positioned here specifically because they believed I would be less likely to resist in a public setting. He finally pulled my hand completely away from the document and stood up straighter. The movement was small, but it changed the space again. My mother's eyes followed me immediately. My father's posture stiffened. "Emily," he said again, more firmly now, "sit down." He did not. For the first time, I stepped slightly away from the table instead of toward it. The distance between me and the papers suddenly felt meaningful. Not because I was rejecting them yet, but because I was no longer contained by them. My mother's voice softened again, almost pleading now. "You are tired," she said. "We can talk after the ceremony. Just do not make a scene right now." He looked at her and realized how carefully the language had shifted over time. From instructions to expectations to warnings to emotional framing. All designed to bring me back into compliance without ever needing to acknowledge that what they were asking was not neutral. He turned my head slightly and looked at my father one more time. "You already made the decision," I said quietly. There was no emotion in my voice. Only clarity. I hesitated for the first time. Just a fraction. But I saw it. My mother tried to step in again, but I raised my hand slightly, not aggressively, just enough to stop the rhythm of the conversation. And then I said the only thing that had not been said yet. "The only thing left is whether you expected me to agree quietly, or resist out loud." The silence that followed did not belong to the wedding anymore. It belonged entirely to us.